Welcome back, my lords and ladies, to the Cast Beyond the Wall. We are your guide to all things Westerosi, and we're here to bring you a review, analysis, and fan v fan debate on each episode of HBO's Game of Thrones successor series, House of the Dragon. In today's discussion, we're going to provide our initial review of the House of the Dragon Season 1 finale, The Black Queen, before giving a breakdown of the story, and then we'll close out the show by speculating about what we think might happen next and this week's winner, loser, and wild card player for the week. I'm your host, Caleb Masters, and who says you need dreams to accomplish things? I, for one, just think you need more dragons. Turns out all you need is dragons, or the biggest dragon, as we discovered in this episode.
Yeah, powerful dragons definitely seem to be a key piece.
So Daniel, our new marketing plan for the Cast Beyond the Wall, we're going to stop harassing people about reviews and ratings. We're just going to get a dragon and find all the other Game of Thrones podcasters on the internet and see if that doesn't help boost our listenership. Are you down?
Yeah, it sounds like a great plan. I'm all in.
Thanks, Damon, for that pro tip, man. Don't know how we could have done it without you. Listeners, as you can hear, I'm joined again by my ever-reliable co-host from the Riverlands of Southern Illinois, sir.
Hi, Daniel Stoll. And I have to say, I really appreciate how Rhaenyra has followed in her father's footsteps. You know, we talked about how he had that great model of King's Landing, and now Rhaenyra has followed up with her own like epic map. And I feel like she also would just make a great dungeon master. Like you're always going to have a great map, and some great pieces to work with. And so, I would be very quick and happy to play in her game.
Daniel, I'm super excited to play in your next Dungeons and Dragons game, in which you meticulously carve a painted table. It's really impressive. How did you go about carving that table? Like, listeners can't see it; it's audio medium, but I can see that you're currently whittling away at a miniature right now. How's that going for you?
You're speaking in jest, but actually, my uncle lives pretty close to me, and he is very good with like woodworking and things like that. And I'm actually in the process of building a table myself. Are
you going to send your uncle a photo of the painted table from this episode and be like, I want this, and see what he says? I can't wait.
Unfortunately, it's a little late to make those types of changes to the table. So maybe next time.
All right. Well, listeners, there you have it. Next D&D game, Daniel Stoll's house. I'm very excited to welcome back returning guest. Honestly, at this point, one of the most legacy guests we have on the Cast Beyond the Wall, because I'm welcoming back one of my good friends, Sir Ben of House Friend, back to the Cast Beyond the Wall. Ben, welcome back, sir. It's been way too long.
It's good to be back. Hello, everybody from the frigid north of Chicago, where it's October 24th. We've already had to cut open our horses and shelter ourselves in their innards for warmth. And this is what we call the mild season. So it's very good to be back before the frigid wind finally takes me.
Oh, man. Ned Stark is back. I guess Ned Stark was right. One tip, Ben, please don't go sacrificing any small children in order to summon the fire gods.
No, that's not till February.
Okay. We got some time to work with. Well, Ben, again, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Listeners tuning in for the first time or tuning in this season, Ben Friend has been on this podcast every season, once a year, all the way back to almost a decade ago. So, Ben, I'm pretty sure you are the only person other than Austin Lucari who has been on at least in one episode of every season. So congratulations for that unique distinction. And you still bring the quality analysis as always.
Now, I know that on Saturday Night Live, when you do 5 guest hosting stints, they'll give you like a jacket. You get a jacket for the 5 Timers Club. You can go ahead and bring it out. I know you've been trying to be sneaky about it. You wanted it to be a surprise, but come on, what'd you get me?
Oh yeah, hold on. Let me just find it down here. Oh, it's I got you a Daenerys pop figure. I guess you can't see it. But yes,
God, it's all I've ever wanted. Thank you so much.
And it's even the one that's got a dragon on her shoulder, Ben. I'll make sure it's air delivered to you by dragon, the same dragon Daniel and I will use to visit and send notes to the other Game of Thrones podcasters out there.
Beautiful.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen, we have so much to cover today. But before we do, I do want to call out a couple of important announcements. First up, just a quick reminder. We are going to have at least one other episode of the Cast Beyond the Wall after this week's episode, before we go on a long hiatus until season 2. Season 2, which is not going to come any sooner than spring of 2024. So it's going to be a long wait. Unfortunately, I read that they aren't starting production on season 2 until spring 2023. So if they really power through, we might get it spring 2024. But honestly, I would really keep those expectations low and maybe more like fall of 2024 if we're in good shape. But if you want to follow up on all the takes here on the Cast Beyond the Wall between now and then, you can follow us on Twitter at cast_beyond_GOT and on Facebook at facebook.com/cast beyond the wall. And again, we'll have at least one more episode recapping the season in total before we go on that break. Now, if you've been tuning in each and every week to the Cast Beyond the Wall, or at least multiple weeks in a row, and you have not yet rated this podcast on Spotify or Apple, I am going to summon a faceless man to come to your house, okay? Listen, we don't ask for a lot. We're not crowdsourced. We do this out of the goodness of our hearts and our love for our small and engaged audience. But seriously, you guys are the best. We've gotten more reviews that I'll read in our last episode on Apple. Listeners, you are the best. The one thing you could do to support us that would go a really long way is just by logging on to Apple and leaving us a 5-star review and a short blurb in the form of a review. And if you're on Spotify, you need to go listen to an episode, perhaps this episode. Once you've done that, you'll be able to rate the podcast, rate us 5 stars. Last thing I want to call out here is that, again, we will not be spoiling any future events of House of the Dragon. So there is Fire and Blood is out there with tons of spoilers. Ahoy. I mean, we are entering the what is known as the Dance of Dragons. We're not going to be talking about any of that in this week's episode. And there isn't even a next time on to discuss this week. With all that said, let's go ahead and jump into our review of this week's episode, The Black Queen.
The Greens are coming for you, Rhaenyra. And for your children.
You cannot bend the knee to the High Towers. They stole your birthright.
Every man standing round the painted table urges her to plunge the realm into war.
Lay siege to the Red Keep.
Send us.
I swear to ward the Queen.
Your cause owns a power that has not been seen since the days of old Valyria.
So according to IMDb, the official synopsis for The Black Queen reads, while mourning a tragic loss, Rhaenyra tries to hold the realm together and Daemon prepares for war. Daniel Stoll, what did you think of the season 1 finale of House of the Dragon?
Listeners recall from last week, I was coming in not super hot on last week's episode. I thought it was good, but was a little mild. But I feel like this episode really made me appreciate that episode a lot more. I really like the focused storytelling we get of, basically last week's was, Alicent's and the Greens episode. And then in this episode, you have Rhaenyra and, the Blacks episode. And now that I have both of those pieces, I really like how we got 2 episodes dedicated to those 2 sides of the story. And so in retrospect, I like what they did. And so I really liked this episode. I felt like it was a really satisfying finale while also setting up the rest of this show. And we've talked a lot about how this season feels like a prologue. And I think that's really what this season feels like when we hit the end. It's given us just a little bit of a taste of what the show is going to be going forward. And so there was a lot of beautiful cinematography in this episode. There was a lot of tension in this episode. I feel like that's one thing this season has gotten really well is the tension. So 2 years is a long wait. I'm not ready to wait that long. I'm ready to get to the next part of the story.
Well, Daniel, I'm glad to hear that you've gone from last week, it was a mild Taco Bell sauce packet to it sounds like at least a hot, maybe a fire level Taco Bell sauce packet for this week's episode of Black Queen.
Yes, definitely. I think this episode brings the 2 episodes together for me and a really, really nice complete package.
A very saucy package.
Yes.
Well, where are my manners? How did I forget, Ben Friend? Before we even talk about this episode, I've got to get your thoughts on the season as a whole. What have you thought of House of the Dragon season 1?
I was a big fan of this season as a whole. I do think for the most part, this show has proven itself to be a really worthy successor to the original series. I still love that original series. We were kind of talking about this off pod, but I think that even the parts of the last couple of seasons that don't work quite as well or may have felt a little or more than a little on the rushed side. It doesn't take away from the enjoyment that I had for the series as a whole, or the love that I have for these characters. I was very excited to be introduced back into this world, and I think that it's proving itself to really be a great spiritual successor to the original show. If I've had any sort of qualms or concerns or complaints about this season as a whole, I think the time jumps were a little jarring. I do think that some of the pulpier elements of the show have taken some adjusting to when compared to Game of Thrones. We've had a season of paternity squabbles, people faking their own deaths, love triangles. This is stuff that's a little soapier than Game of Thrones itself often went. But I do think, taken on their own terms, a lot of that stuff is still really entertaining. And I think these last 3 episodes in particular have been just like vintage Thrones. This has felt very much like the early days of Game of Thrones. I've gotten that same sort of feeling, the excitement and the tension, how so much of it boils down to, the politics, the people in the dark rooms plotting against each other. That's what I love about this show. And I have seen today some reactions to the last couple of episodes as being anticlimactic. There isn't enough action. There aren't enough big twists and turns. I think it's very much besides the point. It makes me kind of wonder if those are the people who maybe were more interested in what Game of Thrones did in the later seasons than what it did in the earlier seasons, with the character moments and the palace intrigue. So yeah, ultimately I leave this season feeling very excited about what the future will hold for the series, and really feeling good about the direction that it's heading. And I think in terms of this episode in particular, I feel very much like you did, Daniel, that this episode makes episode 9 better in retrospect, because they're episodes concentrated on the two sides of what's going to become this great conflict. And particularly, they are episodes about how our two central women, Alicent and Rhaenyra, are finally brought into the cause of waging war against each other, even though they're both hesitant to do so in different ways, which is something that we'll talk about. But I think taken together, this is like the perfect setup for these future conflicts, so that you really understand the hesitancy and the heartbreak that is going to go into these two women, these former best friends, having to go for each other.
Here's the thing. I think this episode, The Black Queen, really encapsulates a lot of the best and the worst of this series so far. And what I mean is, the best, we are going to look back on season 1, and though the time jumps have been jarring, and I do feel like we may have lost some really powerful potential character work, most specifically with Daemon being a big one, I do think it's going to be worth it in the long run. Because even just in these last 2 episodes, because we understand where these characters are at, we really care about what goes down. I love seeing that both Rhaenyra and Alicent, in their own ways, are trying very hard to not go to war. They're being the reasonable voices in the room. And we know that because they have a personal relationship, which is pretty big, but like they're also blood related. I know the age difference probably throws a lot of people off, but Alicent's kids are Rhaenyra's half siblings, right? So, I mean, this is a conflict that is very deeply rooted in family squabbles. And the thing about family is, you can't really hate them until you love them first. It seems like there's no way around a war, but I have to find a way. And they're both determined to do that, while the people around them are insistent on going to war as quickly as possible. So that's really great. I actually think there is some good spectacle. I think the closer of this episode, firstly, last week, even though, there was the dragon bursting out of the floor, cool moment, so have you. I actually think the more impressive part of last week's episode was the pacing, and the who's going to find Aegon first was way more compelling to me than the actual, surprise dragons in the room sort of thing. This week, though, I think had some straight up more classic Game of Thrones spectacle that we got in the later seasons. I mean, it was a little scene to whet the appetite. It wasn't even really a dragon fight as much as it was a slaughter. I still thought the entire sequence in which Aemond and Vhagar are just almost like a serial killer stalking Luke or Lucerys through the clouds was really, really just effective storytelling. And again, having not read what's to come, I was genuinely not sure how that was going to go down at the end of the day. So I think it gets the spectacle right. Things that I think are a little tough. It goes back to, I think some characters that I really like have gotten the short end of the stick. Number one, the big one for me is Daemon. I love Daemon. Matt Smith is having so much fun. He delivers. He's completely unpredictable. He's a disruptor, and you really get the sense of how much he cares about Rhaenyra, almost as much as he cares about killing people he doesn't like. And there's the question of like, which one is more important? Love that stuff. But I do feel like because the work hadn't been put in on him earlier in the season to have a complete narrative character arc, it makes it a little tougher to kind of understand why he does certain things. I'd also go as far as, and this is more for the last two episodes, less this episode, last two episodes. Otto Hightower, I don't necessarily need a whole lot to understand his motivations. He's in it for power. But I will say, in retrospect, it would have been nice to have gotten a little more on maybe what is driving the Hightower cause, so to speak. I mean, like when you think about Game of Thrones, you have the Lannisters, and you understand that family and legacy is of prime importance to Tywin. I don't really feel like we get that with Otto as much here, and therefore his inclusion in this episode feels kind of weird. Why send the hand of the king, your second most important man in the kingdom, to basically get I mean, if it wasn't for Rhaenyra, he totally would have been dead. That's a very long way of saying I like this episode quite a bit. I think it's a very solid finale. I think it really captures the best and worst of the series so far. And I am extremely excited to see where they go in season 2. I think they've put in the work to develop these characters, develop these relationships through a more focused story to set up the bloodbath that's to come. Ben, I want to circle back to you here in terms of a season 1 capper. Did this work for you?
So Daniel said something about this season as a whole being a prologue, which I think, can speak to a lot of maybe the issues that I've had with the season as a whole, feeling like it's a lot of table setting or feeling like they've got a lot they need to get through because like they've got, ostensibly 2 or 3 more seasons at least of bigger fish to fry. I think in terms of setting out, of doing what it set out to do, I think that this episode works fantastically. At the end of the day, like what this season needed to accomplish was, as I said, take Alicent, take Rhaenyra, take them from being, best friends and innocent, wide-eyed children to being the 2 women at the front of an all-out bloodbath. And I think that the last 2 episodes in particular have been instrumental in getting the characters to those places. So I would say, to me, I found it to be a satisfying ending on the basis that I know, and I've not read Fire and Blood, by the way. I don't know what's coming after this, so I'm very much in your camp here. But I know that the storytelling in this season is entirely in service of a larger story. And I think that it felt very much, especially at the end, which we'll talk about, but the very final scene really got my blood pumping to kind of be like, oh, here we go. Like now it's going to pop off. And I think for some people that might end up being frustrating because they feel like, maybe they got built up and now they've got to wait 2 years. But for me, like that's the most exciting stuff is for me to go, God, I can't wait, So yeah, ultimately I do think this ends up being a pretty satisfying finale, especially on the terms that the season to this point have set for it.
When Game of Thrones season 1 aired, people in general didn't know as much about the Song of Ice and Fire. We hadn't experienced it. But, if you look back at that first season of Game of Thrones, in a lot of ways, you could also view it as something of a prologue to the War of the Five Kings and everything that follows that. Ben, just to kind of, echo what you said there. If I'm thinking about, we'll have to see how the show turns out, but it definitely feels like this season was setting out. Maybe it didn't have a quote unquote Ned Stark, well, all the rules are broken moment, but it did accomplish the setup of, oh, wow, now that this terrible thing or these terrible things have occurred, now we're in for like the meat of the story. Now, again, viewers experiencing Game of Thrones the first time who hadn't read the books probably didn't realize that at the time. And I do wonder if a lot of sort of the disappointment or maybe kind of head scratching is due to just viewer expectations that have, developed around this series and knowledge around this series that has developed over the last decade or so. Daniel, what are your thoughts on this as a finale?
Yeah, I think that it worked really well. Now that we have the full story, the full season to kind of look back on, I think that it's we've been talking all season about how this is going to explode at some point. And we've arrived at that moment. Like the explosion is just, we got a taste of it in this episode. And like the rest of the show is going to be that explosion. And so, yeah, I think it works really well as a season. And that, I think that's just in television. When you have a first season, you have to establish the characters. You have to, do a lot of table setting so that you understand these characters, so that later on you have that like payoff of why the characters are going to do what they're going to do. So we kind of like what Ben was saying, like we get Rhaenyra to the point where we can understand what she, like whatever she does in season 2, we're going to understand why she's doing it now, because we've gotten her to the point where she needs to be for the purpose of the story. So yeah, I think it works really well. And last week I had said something like, I was wanting like the, sort of the Ned Stark, like everything, the world changing moment. But I think that was unfair. I talked about how I think that was really unfair for me to bring that sort of expectation into that. And, this is a different show. Now that we have this episode, it really frames the whole season to say like, to prepare us for what's coming next. And I think it does an excellent job at that.
Well, and I would argue the death of Luke, I mean, he's not the main character. There's a lot of differences here. I want to make sure I'm very careful and clear. It's not an equal apples to apples to Ned Stark. Obviously, it's not like Rhaenyra died at the end of the first season or something. However, this death of Luke is what I believe is the inciting incident that is going to cause the war. In that way, it's sort of similar to the Ned Stark death where, once he was dead, it's okay, now everyone's at war. I'm with you. I love the idea of framing this as a prologue. It also enables me to forgive some of the broader strokes that I took with the time jumps. I still think it's a little rocky at times with certain characters, but I do think, to Ben's point, this season nailed Alicent and Rhaenyra through and through all the way. And I would even say Viserys, also another really, really formative, important character. All three of the three of them, they nailed home runs. And those are the ones that really matter for where the story is going to go next. So I think season 1 did a great job.
If I could just quickly expand on the whole, is there a Ned Stark moment? I was watching last week sort of nervously because, Ned Stark famously dies in like the 9th episode of the first season. And there was some part of me that was wrestling with myself about whether or not that was something that I even wanted. And I really ended up respecting the choice to just tell the story and not sort of deal in shock, like a shock moment. I was a little bit concerned that maybe the approach to this story, as it is with a lot of prequels, might be to like repeat sort of the same rhythms as the original series. When George Lucas made the Star Wars prequels, he famously said, oh, well, they rhyme, and I don't think that every story that's told in the same universe needs to rhyme with the one that came before it. So I actually respect the restraint of not looking for some jaw-dropper moment to close out the 9th season. And we've had some jaw-dropper moments in this season for sure. Famously, the man whose head got cut in half. But I think with that in mind, I respect the commitment to story over shock value.
Let's get into the recap of this week's episode. First up, we have Rhaenyra. She receives word of Aegon from Rhaenys, who arrives on, as we predicted, Daniel. She flies straight to Dragonstone and is like, hey, your dad's dead. But before we get there, I actually want to call out a small moment because we haven't really talked about this as much. And there hasn't even been a ton of scenes of showcasing Rhaenyra as a mother, but I think it's really important. So we see Lucerys, or aka Luke, he proclaims that he does not want to be the Lord of the Driftmark. And what this does is it provides Rhaenyra an opportunity to talk with him about a duty, and she also refers to as destiny, a little bit of manifest destiny there, which is not great, but she's Targaryen. What can you expect? And also why power needs to be earned. So, she sort of talks about how, this is the hand you've been dealt, and it's okay to be nervous. You have to work at it to get to that position. Just because you have the title doesn't mean you're in the role yet. You have to learn, and you're going to learn and grow into that role. So just really I wanted to pause there because it is one of those scenes where you get to see Rhaenyra be a mother and maybe a little bit of a leader, but I would say more motherly here. So Ben, I'll start with you. I mean, what does this very small exchange tell you about Rhaenyra's parenting style?
So this was a moment that I ended up feeling really grateful that we were able to have the moments with the young Rhaenyra and now like the older Rhaenyra, because it really informs this whole conversation. I will preface this by saying, however you feel about the royal family in real life, the series The Crown on Netflix is one of my favorite ongoing series. It is probably 90% fictional. I will give it that. But what is so compelling to me about that series is that it starts with the young Queen Elizabeth. You see her; she's a normal girl who is thrust into being royalty essentially overnight. And you see her struggle with the two sides of herself. I think when Rhaenyra as a character works for me really well on this show, it calls back that same sort of dynamic. Here is a girl who maybe she considered it, like a lot of people on this show and in this universe, maybe being born into the royal family, maybe she did think about herself being on the Iron Throne someday. I don't know how you could look at your father there your whole life and not think about what you might do if given that opportunity. But, for all of the reasons that have been brought up by other characters on this show, that was never going to be a realistic option for her. And what she says when she's talking to Luke in this scene, is to say, I had to earn my inheritance. She had to grow into it. She had to be a different version of herself. It was given to her, but she was not ready for it at the time that it was thrust upon her. And so she's somebody who understands, I think, the difference between somebody who seizes power and spends their whole life thinking about power and somebody who is called to lead. And she wants to instill that in her son instead of instilling something else in him. Like he's resisting, like, I don't want to be any part of this. I don't want this. I don't want that. But maybe there's a part of him down the line that could be corrupted to want something else, right? So steering him from a young age to go, look, like, this is you, this is your destiny. Like, you're the one who is going to look after this for me, and I need you on this, and I'm going to show you how to grow into it. I think it's one of the most humanizing moments for that character, and I think that it completes at least this one season arc of sort of seeing how she went from being a child to growing into this role.
Yeah, Daniel?
Yeah, I think Ben said that very well. I think, I was sort of thinking about this in comparison to Alicent, and part of this is because, the Targaryens do have a certain amount of privilege being on the throne or whatever, but the way that she approaches him in this scene is very much like, feels very supportive and encouraging in a way that even though she is saying, like, yes, this is your destiny, she's coming out of her approach like, hey, like, you are capable, you can do this, like, I have faith in you. And it reminded me, I thought back to when Alicent is talking to Aegon, and she's approaching it from a very fearful type of place, like, hey, if we don't do this, we're all gonna die, so that's why we have to do this. Whereas Rhaenyra approaches it from like, hey, like, there is a certain level of respect that she has for the power or for the authority. And so that is why we have this sort of dichotomy that exists in the way that their children engage with each other. So I think that the scene, and we have talked about how this show has definitely framed Rhaenyra to feel more like the protagonist. And I really like Alicent, but it definitely feels like they've positioned Rhaenyra to be the one that we're supposed to be cheering for. And I think you can see that in the scene in the way that she approaches her own children. She's not trying to like scare them like, hey, you have to do this. It doesn't feel forceful, but more of like, this is, the hand or the card, the hand that you've been given. Here's how we can do that, and it feels very encouraging to me. So, I think that speaks a lot to Rhaenyra and the potential that she might have as a leader, down the road.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It really made me think, again, sort of tying it back to her whole season arc. It really made me think a lot of, when she was younger, I do think she had this element that just wanted the power, for the sake of it. And I think we see that scene where Daemon takes her out to Flea Bottom, and, they go to she sees the play and how, the people of King's Landing don't seem to like her very much. And she's like, well, I don't need to worry about them. Who cares what they think? I'm going to be on the throne. And Daemon says, well, you really should care about that. And so whenever she was sort of explaining this, that was a scene that kept popping in my head, that she has clearly grown. She's taken lessons from, again, I think we may have jumped over a lot of the lesson learning this season, frankly, but you can see that she has learned from those early days when she just sort of felt entitled to the throne. Whereas now she's saying, yes, it's yours, but you've still got to grow into the position, and it takes work, and it's okay. You're not going to, figure it out overnight. And Daniel, I think that's a spot on comparison to Alicent, the Hightowers, who, I can't speak to Aegon because he did not, up until the very end of the last episode, he didn't seem to want that position at all. But I mean, in terms of like Otto Hightower, Aegon Hightower, or Aegon Targaryen and Alicent Hightower, it definitely seems like they are trying to grab the power as a means of, for Alicent, survival, for Otto, for a political gain. Not to necessarily lead the people per se. But let's circle back here. So Rhaenys shows up, notifies Rhaenyra and Daemon of the death of Viserys without initially picking a side. Ben, I'll throw it to you first. I mean, what is your take on the differing reactions between Rhaenyra and Daemon here? Because they are quite different.
This is not a surprise, I think, to anyone who had been paying attention to Daemon's character up till now. This has been a moment Daemon's just been waiting on. He, especially when he thought he was going to be the heir. But I think immediately Daemon goes to plotting. Immediately Daemon thinks, what are we going to get out of this? Like, where do we send the troops and when do we send them? Like, immediately, like, his brain goes into full-blown plotting mode. Rhaenyra is obviously shocked because she does have a good relationship with her father. Obviously, the ramifications of this are much bigger because now more is being asked of her. She also has the minor complication of being extremely pregnant at the time. So I think we'll talk about this more, but one of the things that I have loved about this show, and I think that they're leaning into it much more prominently, and I hope that this continues, is very much about how we've got these two women at the center of the story, and everything essentially revolves around the ways that the men around them are trying to influence how they act, and are trying to influence the decisions that they make, and are trying to manipulate the way that they feel about things, be it politically or within the family. I guess in this universe, there's not much of a difference between those two things, between the political and the family. So you have, in this moment, you have, and we're going to get to the birth scene, but you have Rhaenyra, who has, 7 or 8 different things that she's got to worry about. She's got a child on the way. She's got children that she is already, taking care of and trying to help sort of come into their roles. She now has to think about being a ruler, and she has to think about all of the men around her and the influence that they're going to try to push on her. So I think it makes a lot of sense that she has a more complex reaction to this news, probably a more can I say human reaction? I don't think of Daemon as being a pure sociopath by any means, but I think that he is somebody who his every relationship is transactional. And so to me, this is just like another obstacle in his way. I don't remember. It was earlier in the season, and this is not something that I came up with myself. This was something that I read in a write-up of one of the earlier seasons. But in reference to Daemon, somebody said, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's exactly what this moment was for Daemon. Like, he was just ready to strike.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. He's like, oh, there's a war? Cool, let's do it. He's already pre-gamed this scenario in his head, and he immediately jumps into it. I like the calling it more human, though. Also, I just want to reiterate, if we haven't, I'm pretty sure we've said this a few times on this season of the podcast, but I'm going to say it again. God, being a woman is so hard. It's like I got to raise the kids. I got this baby here. Also, I have a job, like an actual job I've got to do, and there's a lot of crazy stuff, and you have to do it all at one time. It's insane. Versus Daemon's just like, what? Kill some stuff? Yeah, let's do it. Like, just vastly different priorities there. Dan, what was your take on the difference in reactions to the news?
Yeah, I think you guys said everything that I really wanted to say. I think even in my notes here, I put it all comes down to the patriarchy is what I put. It's these two, all the men are like, oh, this is an opportunity for us to be, exert our power. Whereas you have both of these women, Alicent and Rhaenyra, trying to say, okay, this is the situation. How do I manage this to the best of my ability without harming people or bringing, violence? That doesn't mean we can't be strong or like make a strong statement, but how do we also like actually take care of the people that are involved? Whereas like all, and Daemon sort of represents that, like all of the men are just like, oh, this is an opportunity for us to like kill some people, get rid of the people I don't like, or, whatever. So I really like this episode and the way that it frames that patriarchy, in retrospect, and how the women respond to it. Like you said, Caleb, and we'll get to that, I think, in the next scene coming up too, that we're going to talk about too, is like the difficulty of being a woman in this setting is astronomically difficult. And it's so much, there's so much that Rhaenyra has to manage and still present as, she's starting off on such a low point. Like she's so disadvantaged already. The fact that she is able to still, come out on top in a lot of ways is just shows how strong of a character she is. And so, I think for me, that's the major difference is like how the patriarchy has disempowered or empowered, Daemon and Rhaenyra. But Rhaenyra's ability to be able to maneuver within that patriarchy is what really makes her a great character for me.
Yeah, well said. And I think I didn't want to gloss over just the reactions they had about Viserys. I do feel like both of them in their own way had a very brief, their most initial reaction was a moment of sadness. And you could even see it on Daemon's face. He did have like a little bit of a sad face, when you get bad news that you lost someone you care about. But again, it was crazy to see how fast they had to pivot from that. And honestly, they were already expecting it anyway, right? It's sort of tough though. They're expecting it. They don't want to hear it. They both seem genuinely sad to varying degrees, but they don't really have time to think on it. They really don't have time to mourn Viserys at all in this episode, which is a little bit tragic. I feel like when you compare this to the High Towers last episode, where it was they didn't really take time to mourn him because they had a political agenda to consider. The Blacks seemed like, oh, this is more of a matter of survival. The enemy has already made moves. How can we protect ourselves? And Rhaenyra's position is we need to see what all cards are on the table and think through how we want to approach this. Also, I'm about to have a miscarriage. And Daemon's reaction is, well, the only way to, a good offense, the only defense, the only defense is a good offense? I probably got that backwards, but he goes into the attack position immediately versus, talking it out or trying to strategize meaningfully. But yes, Rhaenyra, then again, has a very visceral reaction to all the stress, which is she goes into labor prematurely. Daemon immediately, again, as we said, begins preparing for war, summons a war room around the big fancy painted table. And however, Rhaenyra, being as awesome and smart and prepared and thoughtful as she is, sends her oldest son, Jacaerys. She names Jacaerys her heir, and then says, "Go tell Daemon not to do anything until I'm done." Again, just a great moment. She is literally, she could die. We've seen multiple women die in childbirth, and she's sitting up here saying, "Your grandpa's dead. You're my heir. Go tell your uncle to simmer down until this is over." Okay. Also, I want to point out that one of the knights, Kingsguard, probably misstating, at one point says to Daemon, "Hey, do you want to talk to the Maester?" And Daemon just gives him the death glare. And again, there's clear reasons for that. He's already lost one wife to childbirth. He doesn't want bad news. But it is kind of interesting that he is sort of absorbing himself in the potential work or war effort rather than, spending time with his wife when she might not be around. Anyway, here we are again talking about a brutal childbirth on House of the Dragon. Daniel, I'll start with you. What was your take on this specific childbirth? I mean, do you think this serves enough of a narrative purpose to justify its inclusion? Because it's probably like the fourth or fifth one we've seen this season?
Yeah, and they've all been different too, and I think that's important. I think we sort of just talked about it. The difficulty of being a woman in a patriarchal society is incredibly difficult, but this is also something that we don't. I've never, obviously, I know, there are women in my life who have had miscarriages, and it can be an extremely traumatic experience, and that's not something we talk about. Like we're in a point in our real world society where we are really struggling with the way that we treat women and the fact that they don't have a lot of rights, and we're trying to actually take that away right now. So I think that this is a very powerful statement to say, like, this is not something that we talk about, but women are the ones that have to bear all this. Like, men are able to sort of ignore it and go to the war room and talk about it. They don't have to worry about that, but the women do have to carry that burden. And so I think this is extremely hard and difficult to watch, but I also think it makes, again, it really puts a pin in that point of how disadvantaged women are, and the fact that this is not something that we talk about or support women very well in. And so that's something that we need to address in our real world society, let alone in this, House of the Dragon. So for that reason, I think it's really important to have this scene included in this show.
Yeah, it's a tough one every time that it happens in the show, but I have yet to find a time where I didn't think, there is something to it. But Ben, what was your take? Is there something to it?
I think that as well as what you said, Daniel, just like leading into the theme of sort of like the inhumanities that the women characters have to endure, and kind of juxtaposing that with, what the men do or don't have to do. I also think that a large purpose of this scene is to sort of illustrate Rhaenyra as a survivor, right? So you compare this scene with, and I don't know at this point how many of the childbirth scenes there were, but it's obviously at some point it's a pattern. It's, Queen Aemma and Lena Velaryon, both obviously, didn't survive their scenes. And you see potential in this for it to be, fatal for Rhaenyra. She is in unbelievable pain. Clearly, there are a lot of complications. She is refusing, first of all, any and all help. She is, I would say, ostensibly doing this with no painkillers, no milk of the poppy for her in this. All of like the handmaids and stuff are saying like, let us help you. She's not interested in that. She's having conversations, like you said, with other people while she's in the middle of doing all this. She is still juggling all of these balls in the air while she's in the middle of this unbelievably sort of dire situation. And then she pushes through despite the pain, despite, I should say, the physical and emotional pain of this. She struggles through it. And then it sort of seems like she doesn't even have a moment to sort of breathe. Like she has got to bury a child and then just move right on. So, I think that's ultimately what it comes down to, is you kind of look at her versus the other women on the show who, for one reason or another, haven't survived these childbirths. And then you see the way that she has to essentially dust herself right off after experiencing this, profound loss, a loss that, like Daniel was saying, in our real world, like this is something that it takes, women years of therapy and recovery to kind of bounce back from, in this cruel world that, this show exists in. She doesn't have time for that. There are bigger concerns that she has to deal with if she wants to keep up with the men who are doing all the same things as her, but not dealing with, half of the stuff that she's had to endure along with it. So I think thematically, I think it's huge. I think that this episode, and we will probably return to this over and over again, but this episode was huge for Rhaenyra in terms of character development and in terms of like cementing who she is as an adult woman and what she will look like as the head of, a war movement and potentially as a leader that, in theory, we're supposed to be rooting for to succeed.
Yeah, I think, Ben, I'm really glad that you brought up the survivor angle, because we see throughout this episode multiple aspects of Rhaenyra. And this is definitely the survival mode that she is. Again, I want to make sure I don't sell short the other women who died in childbirth. It's not as if they have a say in it per se, but she, for whatever reason, is able to push through. And I think the more important detail is that, like you said, she has to bounce back to be a leader immediately. So we see that sort of like get shit done attitude, which is important. We also see her actively, we see her as a mother, as we noted a moment ago, but we also see her as a friend to Alicent whenever she receives that page. We'll get to that scene later, but we get to see that the soft side of her, where she says, wait a second, maybe there is a different path. Let's figure it out. And I think that's great, because again, I think this show, a common criticism I've heard of this show, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I've heard is we're not sure whose POV we're supposed to be rooting for. And I don't know if you're supposed to be rooting for any of them per se, but I do think that the show is positioning Rhaenyra as the main protagonist, even a little more so than Alicent, I would argue, even though they're both clearly POV characters. And if we're going to buy what the show is selling in later seasons, it really helps when you have an episode like this, where it really is about her kind of stepping into this role as somehow recently crowned queen, but also like war-weary, battle-grizzled queen, who's not afraid to make tough calls. So we'll see. So there is a very brief moment to mourn her baby. They have a funeral scene. However, I would argue the scene, while very sad, is immediately overridden by the fact that Eric with an E, I looked it up, guys. It is Eric with an E, not Arik, is the one who defected. So Eric defects to Rhaenyra's, the Blacks, and he arrives to deliver Viserys' crown, and he swears his loyalty to her. And then we see her immediately after that don, as she's walking down the hallway, we see her don this black cloak and meet her own small council, and has sort of her own coronation of sorts. It's not as big and bombastic as what we saw with Aegon, but I think that's sort of part of the point, which is, leadership doesn't have to be showy. Sometimes leadership is just the job. And she still looks like a badass walking down the hallway in the black dress, just got to say. The crowning of Rhaenyra, guys, this has been the moment we've been waiting for the whole season. Daniel, what did you make of those first moments? Why do you think those moments, those first moments of ruling were so important?
I mean, I think it's going to, we've kind of talked about this already, but I think it really sets up where her, the growth that her character has had from the beginning of the show, but also shows us like the type of leader or ruler that she could be in the future. Now, does that change based on things that happen at the end of the episode? Maybe we can talk about that, but I think it shows that as we just talked about, her initial response is to try to gain. She asks, she looks around, she tries to get everybody's opinion. She doesn't just immediately jump to this is what we're doing, kind of like Daemon did. She is like more open and willing to hear what other people have to say, but also trying to come at it from an approach of how do we not go straight into war? Is there a way that we can solve this in some other way? And so I think that speaks to the type of leader that I don't know how this war ends. I don't know if she wins or loses or whatever. We'll have to see how that goes. But if she were to win, like, we could see that type of that's the type of leader that she could be. And that gives us a reason to root for her. Because I think, at the end of the day, like, we're all the time, we don't want, a bunch of people to die. We would like to see like a good, strong leader keeping peace in the kingdom. Right. And so that gives us another reason to sort of root for her, that she can be a good leader that can keep, the kingdoms together. I think Rhaenys even says, like, she's the one thing keeping this everything at peace, right? Like, she's the one person who's managing stopping the explosion from happening, right? And so I think that really speaks to her leadership style and the character that she is.
Yeah, Ben, any thoughts on what makes these first moments of ruling and leadership so important for her?
I think Daniel hit the nail on the head. I think the number one thing that makes this sort of significant is the sort of consistency of her restraint. And I think that, again, we will see in future seasons, in the next season, based on this episode, if that changes. But I think it's our first opportunity to see what she would do if she was in charge, especially in charge during a time of war or a time of like great sort of peril. And her restraint, for me, it was actually pretty refreshing. It seemed like she has more of her father in her than maybe we would have given her credit for. I won't have a chance to talk about Viserys too much on here because obviously he's no longer with us. I know you guys did too, but I adored that character, and I think if Paddy Considine doesn't end up with an Emmy next year, I'm gonna start rioting. But I think that it was really refreshing from the perspective of somebody who loved the original series and loves this universe to see like a truly decent, if sometimes naive, king who, I think was always leading from a position of wanting to do the right thing. And to see that those lessons, his lessons were sort of well learned by Rhaenyra. Is endearing. And like you said, if we're to believe that she's the protagonist, if we're supposed to, root for her ostensibly, even though, like you said as well, Daniel, like I like Alicent a lot. I think in a lot of ways she may be the one truly decent person on this show. But if Rhaenyra is our protagonist and we're supposed to root for her in any way, I think that these sorts of moments, they only go further towards humanizing her. And I think seeing that with her first taste of power, she's trying to do the right thing, really encouraging.
Yeah, again, nice contrast to when we saw her. I think it was episode 2, episode 3, when they were going to the Triarchy, and she's like, "Why don't we just like take a bunch of dragons down there and roast their ass?" Basically, and it got her kicked out of like the small council meetings. Quite again, just showing that we have seen a lot of growth with Rhaenyra is pretty powerful. Now, another thing I want to mention here is that she does kind of go down the list of, all right, like a good leader, great way to start the conversation. All right, here's the problem. Okay, before we even get to like solving the problem, what resources do we have to solve said problem? And what I mean here is like, okay, who do we have? Who do we know is aligned with us, and who said they would align with us that we can summon, and who maybe do we need to persuade? or remind, in quotes. And again, I thought that was a really cool scene. Again, it's the restraint, it's the thoughtfulness. But I don't think it necessarily solves the problem that they are outmanned initially, at least. So I think I don't think that it's really a question about who's got the larger man. We're moving the dragons from the equation, which we'll get to in a moment. When we're looking at manpower, I don't think it's any question that the Greens have the advantage. The question I have for you both is, do you think the Blacks are positioned to forge the alliances they need to defend their claim? i.e., they might not on paper have those allegiances now, but do you think they have the kind of credibility or clout of the kingdom or the lords from various kingdoms to support the claim? Ben?
I got to be honest, my instinct tells me no. I don't know that, narratively that we may find a way to get them there. But, I do think that there is some truth to the claim. What Otto Hightower said about Aegon, like by every sort of metric of eligibility, Aegon feels like the true heir. I think the plot to have sort of his coronation in that huge crowd in public so that everyone like sees him and understands like this is happening and this is legitimate. And if anybody, tries to undo this, like you saw it with your own eyes, like to get the court of public opinion on your side that quickly is brilliant. I also think that maybe the Blacks don't quite grasp, I would say, the lengths that the Greens will go to ensure loyalty remains on their side. When we saw in the last episode, Otto bring all of the heads of the houses in and go essentially like, hey, you can bend the knee now or not, and then, heads started rolling when they refused to, renounce their oath to Rhaenyra. I think there may be a certain element, and I said this before about Viserys, so maybe this bears repeating. There may be a certain naivete around maybe not understanding the lengths that the Hightowers will go to hold on to power. And I think that there are going to be a lot of houses, even very noble houses, that are going to be scared to death at worst. And at best, you're going to run into a lot of Baratheon type situations where, they're going to go, well, look, I was just told like this is the king and like he's already been crowned. And what do you want me to do about it? Like, you want me to go against the king? Like, I've got my own thing to worry about here. So we'll see. I don't know that I have a lot of faith in them right now.
Yeah, Daniel, what do you think? Do the Blacks have the love of the people, or the lords? I should probably say is more important.
I think it's gonna be tough. I do think that their position maybe is strengthened a little bit later on in the episode, but I think looking back, I didn't really think about it at the time, but looking back, Otto Hightower is very smart, and the way that he had the coronation happen in front of, like, we talked about how massive that scene was last episode, but it didn't fully hit me. Everybody is seeing this happen and registering that this is the new king, and that's something that they're going to have to fight about to change. Not only to say no, actually that was wrong, Rhaenyra should be the queen, but it should also be a woman. Like that's never happened before. We've seen how people really don't want a woman to be in charge. So that doing that in front of that massive number of people is going to be hard for them to change the minds of the people. And at the end of the day, the ruler, most of the rulers are just going to want to do what's easiest. And it seems like it's going to be much easier to just say, okay, maybe it was supposed to be Rhaenyra, but whatever. Aegon's already there, and it's a lot less work on me, right? To have to sort of support Rhaenyra and taking what is rightfully hers. So yeah, I think it's going to be really, really tough for them to. And so yeah, kind of like Ben, my inclination is to say, like, right now, my inclination is to say no. They're not going to be able to gather the support that they would need to win. Now, narratively, perhaps things could change. But as of right, the way it stands right now, I think they're definitely on the losing side to start off.
That Otto Hightower, he understands the value of good PR and optics. Because, he's like, on paper, I mean, Aegon checks all the boxes with Rhaenyra from the jump as a woman, so that doesn't check one box, from the perspectives of, again, the patriarchal society. I think this is, I'm with you guys, this is a huge uphill battle for them. They have to, one, argue that Aegon is an invalid ruler. 2, convince them that Rhaenyra would be a better ruler. And 3, convince them they can actually win the war. Because that's a high order to any lord who's like caught in the middle of this thing. He's like, well, I don't want to go to war. Why would I do that? This just, they said he's king. Why not name him? Just roll over. You're a woman. Just let him be king. So yeah, I agree. I think the blacks are definitely positioned to the disadvantage, save for one thing. But before we get to the one thing, just want to shout out to my man, Lord Grover. I can't wait until the rest of the Sesame Street shows up. Maybe the Muppets will make an appearance this season. I know it's only a name. I kind of hope we get to Lord Grover. Sounded pretty important because I think he's like the Lord of Riverrun, which theoretically they're going to need that support. So maybe we even get to meet Lord Grover. Please tell me they bring in Grover from Sesame Street. That's the only real way to do this, right?
So the true winner of the Dance of Dragons is Super Grover. That's the wild card no one suspected.
No one suspected Super Grover to show up and take it all. Now, there is one very important element here that Daemon brings up, and very Daemon sense. He's like, who cares? We've got dragons. And then I'm initially thinking, you guys have a few more dragons, but Vhagar's a pretty big dragon from what I hear. We see it later in the episode, but up to this point, I really don't think we had a good sense of scale. But yeah, I was like, okay, you guys got 5 or 6, and he starts to go down the pecking order, and there's like dragons we didn't even know existed. So they have like it sounds like more than 10 dragons theoretically, along with at least 3 that we saw that are being incubated. The dragon eggs are being incubated right now. So Daemon's saying, listen, who cares who has the lords if we have the dragons, as long as we're strategic and we're very strategic in how we deploy those resources, and we're very smart when we in our war tactics, we can have this thing over within a fortnight. He said something like that. So here's my number one question, guys. Do we think dragons are really enough? Because that seems like a cheat code, if you ask me. And obviously, we know that the other side also has dragons. Daniel Stoll, are the dragons enough to win the war for the blacks? Or at least make up for their huge disadvantage that they have with the love and loyalty of the people?
When Daemon first said this, at first I was like, okay, yeah, I think he said this something like 13-4 or something like that, which I was like, okay, that's pretty significant. But I'm reminded, and it's not a straight comparison, not an equal comparison, but I'm reminded of something that happened back in season 1 of Game of Thrones, where Robert Baratheon talked about his speech where he's like, what's the bigger number, 5 versus 1, 5 houses versus 1, like we're talking about the Dothraki. It has their one united force can beat the 5 individual. And so, we talked about the big dragon at the end. Is that one dragon enough? It seems like it at the way that things played out later. So I don't know if the dragons are going to be enough. And also, I think it was Daemon. It's interesting that Daemon's the one that says this, because I think earlier in the season, I think it is Daemon who says that the fact that we have dragons is an illusion. We just use that illusion to like control the people, right? And as we already see in this episode, I don't want to get too far ahead, but like it doesn't seem like there's 100% control over these dragons. So all those things combined make me think that I don't know if the dragon, I think it helps having more, but I don't know if it is so much of an advantage that it overshadows all the disadvantages that we already laid out.
I think that I love the parallel to the Dothraki comparison. I hadn't even considered that, Daniel. So I think that's a nice analogy. Ben, what's your take on the power of the dragons?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, exactly what you were saying about how you essentially can't control nature, that's what it comes down to. Those dragons are going to, I think at best, they're going to sort of mimic the emotions or react to the emotions of whoever is riding them. That's something we'll talk about later, but I think kind of the big climactic scene of this episode, I think it has a lot to do with the dragons sort of feeding off like what the emotions and desires of the people on their backs were sort of feeling. But the idea that, somehow these human characters have any control over these dragons, these forces of nature, yeah, it is a complete illusion. So in theory, yes, like these dragons are powerful enough to, level, entire kingdoms, essentially. We saw that with Daenerys at the end of Game of Thrones, for better or for worse. I know people shudder when we talk about that episode, but at the end of the day, like, yeah, one dragon is like a nuclear bomb. So yeah, having those dragons and having them even just as bargaining chips might be huge, the whole mutually assured destruction sort of thing. But I think a lot of it comes down to how they use it too. You were talking about the Dothraki, and they have a united force and they have each other's backs and they have really strong battle strategies. And this is true for both sides. Yeah, a dragon is powerful, but if you've got like a little kid, like a scared little kid riding that dragon who has no idea what he's doing, that might end up being actually more trouble than it's worth. So I think it's a nice thought if you are the underdogs in a war to think, look, like we've got the nuclear option. But it's going to be entirely dependent on whether or not, at the end of the day, you want to rule over a kingdom or you want to rule over a pile of ashes, right? So, yeah, we'll see how that ends up panning out. Obviously, the power is there, but I'm not sure it's smart strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. You took the words right out of my mouth about the, to what end do you have dragons, right? And I think I'm so glad, again, the restraint from Rhaenyra, especially when Daemon's pushing her so hard, is just so welcome. He's like, yeah, we'll unleash the dragons. And she's like, yeah, but I don't, like, how is it I am planning to rule? Am I going to rule out of fear? Because that's a very fear tactic. And moving beyond the fear tactic, if we are ever, God forbid, forced to like leverage one of these things or pull that lever, like this thing's going to eradicate a kingdom, like you said, a nuclear bomb is going to level this. So it also speaks to what kind of ruler do you want to be, where you rely on the quote unquote nuclear option with the dragons to keep the people in line. And it's funny. I think young Rhaenyra definitely felt like she was of that ilk. I don't think she's of that ilk now, though. I think she really wants to lead because A, she's worked for it, and B, because she's learned how to be a good leader. And I say that in the truest sense. Like, it's removing the titles. Even if she wasn't heir of the throne, I think she could lead any kingdom. Removing like all the fancy titles and whatnot. She's like really honed that skill. And I just don't think using dragons are really something she would be willing to deploy unless absolutely necessary. So speaking of things that seem absolutely unnecessary, let's talk about how Otto makes his way down to Dragonstone once again. So by the way, I mean, listen, I'm assuming this is a scene that happened off camera. I'm assuming Alicent says, no, you've got to go down. If you're the one who insists on this whole crazy scheme, you've got to be the one who go down and drop the message to her. This is the only thing I can come up with as to why the second, or depending on how you rank the power between the king, the queen, and the hand, one of the three most powerful people in all of Westeros walks down right into the enemy camp where he knows that Daemon is going to be actively hostile. It just seemed weird tactic, weird play, but it is where it is. So Otto does offer a peaceful terms of surrender, and he allows Rhaenyra the option to keep Dragonstone, so she would be the lord of and ruler of Dragonstone. He also, again, has been noted earlier, highlights, well, yeah, like, listen, we already have the throne on lock. People already believe it. He wears the crown. He's Aegon the Second, Aegon the Conqueror, the one who basically built this whole Seven Kingdoms thing. He's got the name, he's got the crown, he's got the sword, and he's already been, blessed by the light of the Seven or whatever. So he's the guy. Nothing you say is going to matter. So since we've already taken the power, here's the best alternative we can give you. Now, I do think it's funny that Rhaenyra and Daemon scoff at the offer until the Maester gives Rhaenyra a page from the book that you may remember Alicent and Rhaenyra were discussing in the very first episode related to Rhaenyra, the character Rhaenyra. Also, I just want to point out, I like how Otto, third most powerful man in the realm, snaps his fingers and is like, Maester, highest Maester in all the lands, bring me that one page. He couldn't just, keep it in his pocket or something. He's like, you Maester. And it's like the High Maester too. Again, sending some of the VIPs of the entire kingdom to go have this meeting. Just, wild. I thought this was a nice bit of symmetry, kind of echoing back to that second episode where, again, Rhaenyra saved Otto's ass from Daemon, not once, but twice. Ben, friend, what did you make of this reunion? Were you expecting a bloodier exchange? What did you think about how it went down?
No, I wasn't expecting a bloodier exchange, and I think the reason for that goes back to what I was saying earlier. I don't want to act like okay, maybe I do. I don't want to sound like I've got a lot of respect for Otto Hightower, but I do think that he's a master strategist, and he is a master manipulator. That page was his insurance policy, and he played Rhaenyra like a fiddle. And so I think that he knew that it wasn't going to be a bloodier exchange. And I think the fact that he was there in person was entirely by design. I think maybe the Greens understood how delicate the situation was going to be. They didn't want to send somebody expendable just because they wanted to assume that it was going to devolve into violence. They sent somebody who knew how to control the situation and command the room and keep there from being bloodshed. And so, I think it played out sort of how I anticipated, but I also was, again, sort of shocked / impressed with just how many steps ahead Otto was at any given time. One more thing, you were totally on point about him snapping his fingers and being like, bring me one folded up page out of a book. He is getting off on any sort of power that this situation gives him. And even if I do agree with what you were saying earlier about maybe Otto being sometimes a little underdeveloped or feeling like maybe he's just interested in power for power's sake. I think through this whole season, I think Rhys Ifans has given an incredible performance. I think this is a really good example of when the right actor imbues a character with a personality and sort of a vibe and sort of like an aura that commands that sort of respect. So I selfishly enjoyed that he was in this scene because I've really enjoyed just watching this performance all season.
Yeah, Ben, I just want to stop you right there and say you and I, 100%. I think I described him. One, he was one of the few actors I recognized the name of going into this season. There was I think 3 or 4 of them that we called out in our preview episode. I was like, I know who this person is. He also played the most famously, I wouldn't say that not his best work, but most famously, listeners may recognize him as the Lizard from the Andrew Garfield, The Amazing Spider-Man. But no, I love it because I love when you see actors who were really good given some really juicy material. And I think you're spot on. I do think he's a little underdeveloped. However, because of the performance by Rhys, it's Rhys Ifans, right?
I think it's Rhys Ifans. The last name I might be wrong, but it is Rhys.
It's Rhys. So the performance that Rhys Ifans gives levels up the whole the whole character by a couple of notches. And I think I do kind of like him. He kind of sucks up even when he's not saying much, which he frequently isn't. He just sort of soaks up a lot of the energy scene to scene in a good way. He's like I think early season I described him like as a self-professed Peter Baelish fan.
Of course.
He is doing the same thing. The one thing that's like, he's honestly doing similar tactics where he's very quietly and smartly making very powerful political moves that to people who aren't watching wouldn't know otherwise. But that's how he's been able to gain all this traction and power. The difference between him and Baelish, though, is you see a lot of one-on-ones with Baelish and other people, whereas with Otto Hightower, I think it's mostly with Alicent we get a lot of good one-on-ones, and then they get a couple good one-on-ones with him and Viserys as well. But Daniel, what was your take on this entire scenario? Sorry, I got us all on track there. Other than to say, Otto Hightower, great character. Can't wait to see him come back for more next season. Daniel, what do you think of this exchange?
Yeah, Otto Hightower is great. But I was not as convinced, actually, that this wasn't going to go bloody. I mean, we've seen Daemon before react to messages that he does not like, and he reacts very aggressively usually. So I was a little bit worried in the scene that there would be blood. There would be some blood. Maybe, not like a kill of Otto, but maybe like one of the no-name characters or something like that. So I was a little concerned. I do think it does take some guts on Otto to show up. I mean, I think, again, we have seen Daemon get messages that he doesn't like, and he is very quick to dispose of those people. The head chopping when he chopped the guy's head off in the council, all the way back to like episode 2, I think it was, when he gets that message from Viserys before the war. He just kills that guy randomly for delivering the message. So I was concerned, but again, I think you guys laid it out. I think Otto's being very smart here, and because if they respond, that does not look good for. He's sort of like baiting them a little bit, because if they respond, it only strengthens his position in any kind of way. So thankfully, Rhaenyra is there and able to show that restraint that we've talked about. Because I do think Daemon probably would have done something if Rhaenyra was not there. So. And then also, like you guys mentioned, the page was very important to sort of tug on Rhaenyra's heartstrings a little bit to say, to manipulate her in that way. So overall, though, it was a fantastic scene. And I even though nothing actually happened, I still felt the tension that exists between all these characters, and I thought it was very palpable in that scene.
Well, and I just love how it echoes that scene we saw in episode 2. But I like it now because we have so much more context and backstory, and these characters have all grown in their own ways. So the context is different. So the tension is just ratcheted up like crazy. And there's a nice bit of the as George Lucas would call it, the rhyming. The rhyming. It rhymes with the second episode. But in this way, I think it sort of highlights, like, Daniel, you're right. If Rhaenyra is unsuccessful in stopping Daemon, and there is a response, the Blacks are the ones who started the war, which, again, is still a win for the Greens, right? Okay, so we now move on to Rhaenyra and Daemon, who, after this scene, have decided they're not on the same page about how to resolve the conflict. And I love how they have all the small council and they're debating. And then clearly Daemon and Rhaenyra are just fuming at each other. And then Rhaenyra's like, Mom and Dad need to talk. All of you leave the room. So you get some one-on-one action. It sounds like Rhaenyra was genuinely considering the terms so as to keep the realm together to prepare for the, in quote, Song of Ice and Fire, the prophecy that Viserys had spoken of. And it turns out one of two things happened. One, Viserys never shared the prophecy with Daemon, or two, even if he did, Daemon totally blew him off, as Daemon typically tended to do with anything Viserys said. And he cited that quote that was in the trailer from the very first trailer for House of the Dragon, which is, "Dreams didn't make us kings, dragons did." As he is he's strangling Rhaenyra, has his hand to her throat in a very threatening, imposing stance. And I just have to turn to you guys. I mean, it seems like, based on what we know, that prophecy was to be passed down to the heir. So why wouldn't Viserys tell Daemon about it? Daniel?
Yeah, I think, Viserys and Daemon had an interesting relationship, and though they loved each other, there was never like they had love for each other, and that was what kept the relationship at ease in a lot of ways, despite the fact that Viserys banishes Daemon two times, three times. But despite that, they do have love for each other, and that prevents a lot of violence potentially occurring between their relationship. So, and we know Viserys was definitely a guy who was just wanted things to be easy and at peace. He didn't, like even in his last moments, he was just like, "Can we just get together, be a family, and just have a nice dinner together?" Like he just wanted to chill. So I think part of it is I don't know if he fully trusts Daemon, but I also don't think that he knows Daemon too. I don't think he would think Daemon would care that much either. And pretty early on, Viserys says that Rhaenyra is going to be the heir. So I don't think that I think there's a lot that goes into it, but I don't think he ever really expected him to lead, and doesn't think that he would care too much about the prophecy. Daemon seems very opposite to Viserys in that way, where he is much more pragmatic or practical in his approach, maybe irrational in extreme in some ways too, but he doesn't seem to mess around in the sort of like prophecy dream. He's much more what's in front of me, and a little more grounded in that way. So I think that is probably why Viserys didn't. But I don't know. That was sort of my take.
Yeah, Ben. So it sounds like maybe Daniel thinks that Viserys didn't trust Daemon, and even if he did, Daemon probably wouldn't have taken him seriously. What was your take on why Viserys hadn't shared that, kind of important point of information that seemed to be like the most important information you could possibly have in the kingdom that they're keeping a secret?
So I'm of two minds on this. Number one, I think the idea that he never expected Daemon to actually succeed him is probably spot on. I think he had every intention of having a son and living long enough for that son to take over for him. The fact that I think even if Daemon had not done what he'd done in the first episode and proven himself to be untrustworthy or unstable or, whatever you want to call it. I think even if that hadn't happened, I think the death of the queen and his loss of potentially, his one true heir, I think would have been enough to push him towards naming Rhaenyra heir to begin with. The next part of it is that when Viserys was on his deathbed, when he was talking to Alicent, but obviously he thought he was talking to Rhaenyra, and started talking about the Song of Ice and Fire, talking about the prince that was promised and who was going to hold the kingdom together. I think that sort of tells me that he had come to believe that prophecy was for Rhaenyra. Whether he believed that all the time, is up for debate. But I think by that point, there would not have been any need to bring that to Daemon, because somebody with Daemon's temperament and somebody with Daemon's history and background, I don't think he would legitimately believe that Daemon could be the subject of that prophecy. And he also was not somebody who would have used that specifically for political gain. There's the scene in the last episode where Alicent gives Aegon the blade and is talking about, hey, look, like, believe it or not, like, this is you. Like, this is what, this is your destiny. And that's kind of what gets him to like go like, oh, wow, like this really is me. Like he kind of accepts that calling. That's not something Viserys ever would have done. He took the words of that and the warning of that very seriously. So I would say that he probably never took Daemon seriously enough to even bother conveying that to him.
Yeah, I definitely am with you, both of you guys. I don't think there was ever a point where Viserys expected Daemon to take the throne. It was always a temporary, like, if I get assassinated, if I die tragically and there's no one else, it'll be yours. But at the same time, I mean, in the first episode, he was obsessed with having a male heir. And it's kind of funny, and something else we might dig into a little more in our season retrospect. Otto Hightower was the one who insisted they put Rhaenyra in the position of heir of the throne so that he could push Daemon out of it, because he considered Daemon, a flight risk. But I do think, to your point, Ben, I do think that Viserys did believe that he believed that Rhaenyra was inherently that type of leader, or he could help make her that type of leader who would prepare the realm in a way that is, scalable is probably not the right word, but she could lead the Kingdom of Westeros to prepare for such a great invasion from the evil in the Great North. And I don't think he ever believed that with Daemon, not one time. But seems like there might be some resentment from Daemon on that point. He just, and in classic Daemon fashion, he just shrugs it off as, well, he was obsessed with dreams and prophecy, and where did it get him? So clearly, I think whether Viserys admits it or not, Daemon would not have received that prophecy well had he been given that information. Let's shift gears here, though, because, guys, there was, in fact, a huge plot twist this week. Massive, in fact. And that is the fact that the sea snake, Corlys Velaryon, lives despite what was presumably his death off screen. We were pretty upset about it. He is alive and kicking. And we get another scene between Rhaenys and Corlys, where she updates him on everything he missed from the last 7 years. He's like, yeah, your brother. Yeah, Matt. Yeah, Daemon killed him. Rhaenyra is about to go to civil war. You missed a few things. She kind of fills him in, and his initial reaction is, wow, I can't believe Rhaenyra just caused all of this awfulness on the realm. Everything she touches turns to dust. But then Rhaenys, Daniel, as you pointed out earlier, has to sort of talk him into, hey, she's the only reason we're not already at war. She's trying to keep all of the violent delights at bay, so to speak. And then pledges his loyalty to Rhaenyra in the next scene. And also, this creates a bit of a potential advantage that I think the Blacks desperately need, and that is that, the sea snake, maybe being a bad dad, maybe being a bad husband, was off trying to recapture the Triarchy. I guess, again, another thing I'm kind of confused about is apparently he was trying to leverage this to gain the throne somehow. Different conversation. But the benefit to Rhaenyra is, hey, he has pledged allegiance to Rhaenyra and the Blacks, and he controls, or his fleets control the Triarchy, which is the shipping lanes that have basically bring in all of the resources from across the Narrow Sea, including Essos and Pentos. So earlier we talked about how we're not sure if the Blacks have the support of the realm and of the lords and their pledges. However, now we're talking about a different kind of advantage. It's not just dragons, it is resources. So do you think that Corlys and Rhaenys' support marks a change in Rhaenyra's future fortune in the war? Daniel?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty big thing. I think it's even, we talked about the dragons. I think this is a much bigger deal even than the dragons. I think if if you're able to control the shipping lanes, it's made basically clear that, Corlys controls the seas. And if you have his influence, you control all of that. So I think that's really important for them to be able to have that, because I think that is more likely to convince other houses to offer their support to Rhaenyra instead, because I'm sure that process is needed for them to, trade with other houses or do any sort of business that they need to do that doesn't take place exactly in their area. So I think this is going to be a key part in their ability to convince other houses to also offer their support. I think if they didn't have this, they basically they'd be dead in the water. But because they have this, there's a hope that others will be able to join. And I think that's really more of the convincing piece than it is like the actual like manpower. It's that they can use this as leverage to get other people to also join their side.
Yeah, Ben, what are your thoughts?
I would echo all of that, just with the caveat that the power and influence that they are going to gain by having the Velaryon support it really only matters as much as they are actually loyal and trustworthy. Let's not forget that in this conversation, Corlys says, look, we're not going to pledge to anybody. We are just going to go ahead and skip town, and we're going to retire. We're not going to get involved in this. Like, I'm not interested in maneuvering for power anymore. And it's Rhaenys who says, look, like, we are going to, we're going to keep doing this. You're going to pledge your support ostensibly for Rhaenyra. We don't see that on screen. But her saying, like, look, say whatever you want about the girl, but she's the only one holding the realm together, and we've got to do this. And I would not necessarily argue that this is her entire motivation, but I do think that Rhaenys is someone to watch potentially as being somebody who, is going to be an opportunist who's going to be looking for a chance to strike when she thinks it might benefit her and potentially give her the throne that she feels like she was owed in the first place. And we have seen up till this point that Corlys feels exactly the same way. We've had multiple conversations where he has talked about how she was denied the throne when it was rightfully owed to her. And you see that throughout the episode where all of the people around Rhaenyra are bending the knee, and Rhaenys doesn't do that. Like, at the end of the day, she is out for herself and her family. So I think let's see how legitimate that offer is. Let's see how conditional the terms of that offer is. And then we'll see sort of how beneficial that'll end up being for the cause.
I'm so glad you called that out, Ben, because I brought this up a couple of episodes ago. We've gotten quite a few one-on-one scenes with Corlys and Rhaenys. And I've been it's really been like, okay, this is clearly, and especially now that we know how the season ends, clearly that this is going to pay off in the long run of the show. How it's going to pay off, I don't know. But given the fact that both of them have their own ambitions that we are very aware of, Corlys, again, still not totally clear on his plan, but somehow winning the Triarchy was going to buy him the love of the people, I guess, in hopes that he would get closer to the Iron Throne. And with Rhaenys, she should have had that. So how and when this pays out, those little conversations pay off, I'm not sure. But the fact that, and I'm actually quite glad Corlys is alive, because I thought that we had spent a lot of time on a subplot that went nowhere. But I think it's just to outline that these two it's them against the world, essentially. And they're going to do what is going to get them the most political gain. I do think Rhaenys does have a certain value on family in that she probably will not go out of her way to harm other people. We saw it last week. She easily could have disintegrated the entire Green leadership squad in an instant, but she didn't, because there was some kin in there. And also she sees sort of the motherly look on Alicent's face. And I think she's probably going to afford the same a bit of grace to Team Rhaenyra and the Blacks. But at the same time, they're going to do what's best for them in the long run. And I don't know what that is. And maybe it's convenient for them to side with Rhaenyra today, but, someone's going to flip in this war at some point, right? And they definitely seem like the most likely candidates. Let's move on and talk a little bit about, why don't we just send 2 kids to drive a car? One looks like he might be old enough to have his permit. The other one definitely is not ready to drive the car. And let's send them out to deliver critical mission info for our war efforts. So Jacaerys and Lucerys are assigned to deliver messages to the lords who swore oaths to Rhaenyra previously. Either they themselves or their fathers, the lords that is, had sworn to Rhaenyra as the heir to the throne. And instead of sending ravens, I actually thought this is from the optics PR perspective that Otto has clearly mastered. Yeah, sending actual kin on Dragonback is a great way to show that you mean business. Unfortunately for Lucerys, he kind of goes to the House Baratheon. He swears on the Lord of the Light of the Seven Bible not to incite violence, so he's inherently in a defensive position. And two, upon arriving to Storm's End, he sees that Aemond is already there. But I do want to pause really quick. Guys, if this was Game of Thrones, we would have had a new location on the map. Storm's End. It's great. I know I already hyped it earlier. I think it was like episode 3 or 4. We see the interior of Storm's End whenever Rhaenyra is playing. She's doing the dating sim, or she's swiping left and right. That technically was in Storm's End earlier this season, but we get to see an exterior. This is the Baratheon stronghold. If you've read the novels, A Song of Ice and Fire, any of those, you know that this is a very important castle, so to speak, for Robert, especially for Renly and Stannis. So there's a lot of history here. Doesn't really play into the plot whatsoever, but I just was kind of geeking out about the fact that we got to see this really cool new location, and I miss my maps where the locations pop up with really cool animations. But anyway, you guys, you can call it out. Am I geeking out too much, or is this a big deal? Daniel or Ben, go ahead.
No, I mean, look, we're going to let you geek out. But I personally didn't feel like we saw enough of it to really get much of a sense of, the general sort of vibe of the place. It was dark and stormy, and it was a dark castle. I didn't get enough of sort of a feel of it to really have an opinion on it one way or another. But I do think it's cool after all these years to see like where one of the main houses comes from. So I'm not going to take that away from you by any means.
Daniel, did Storm's End live up to the name?
I mean, I thought it was cool to see. I'm glad that you're able to have your moment of geeking out, but it was dark, it was stormy, and it was cool looking. But I also, I don't know how significant it is. Well, what I thought was really cool was the way that they shot the scene, which is where you get the flash of lightning and you see the outline of the dragon in the background. I thought that was cool, and that part was very exciting. But the actual location of Storm's End, I was kind of like, oh, that's cool. We see this, yeah.
Vhagar looked like freaking Godzilla back there with the lightning strikes. Holy cow!
Yeah, that was a really cool way to shoot that, or present that. Reveal that he was there already was really cool.
So, this is all very unfortunate. I mean, as cool as Storm's End is, guys, not really paused for a second and talked about it. This whole scenario is very sad for Luke because, again, he realizes Aemond has beaten him to the punch and has already delivered a message, and he doesn't realize it yet, but an offer from King Aegon II. And the offer being that apparently they're offering to wed someone, and I was unclear if it was Aemond who would wed with the Baratheons or if it was someone else of royalty would marry in with the Baratheons to kind of elevate their position in the kingdoms. So versus Rhaenyra's message where she's like, hey, remember that time you promised that one thing? Well, now I'm calling you. And I don't know. I have thoughts, but I want to hear from you guys first. Daniel, what did you think about the difference in approach to leadership or in quotes, reminding the lords of their oaths between Alicent / Aegon and Rhaenyra?
Yeah, I think Otto specifically and the Greens, I guess in general, seem to really understand how to maybe not manipulate people, but they understand that, words don't mean much. It is, what are you willing to offer people? That is much more convincing to people than, some words I said that one time. So the Greens definitely have a strong understanding of that. And we've talked already about how intelligent or strategic Otto is, and he's very quick to the punch, able to even beat Rhaenyra, even though they said that it was just a short flight away from Dragonstone to Storm's End. They're still able to beat them there. So, yeah, I think that it was. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. But yeah, I think the main thing is, Rhaenyra sort of relying on that respect or for power, or sort of the respect that she has for leadership, whereas the Greens are saying like, hey, we know that what you really want is just us, motivate people by fear or by offering power, right? Like going back to the way that Alicent talks to her children, she talked to them in fear was a big motivator, like, hey, we might die, so we got to do this. And they also stand the other side of that, like side with us and we get you all the cool power and positions of power that you don't have. So that's something that the Greens have a really strong understanding of.
Yeah, Ben, what was your take on the difference of approach to winning the loyalty of some of these other lords like the Baratheons?
Yeah, I think ultimately what it shows, and we've talked about this a little bit already, is that the position of Team Rhaenyra is not nearly as strong as they think it is. They are trying to rely on essentially honor to put them over the top, to say, hey, look, you promised, and call it naive or, whatever you want to call it, but it clearly is an outdated approach. I think, ultimately that works during peacetime, but when you've got a house divided and someone has to rule the realm, you promised doesn't really do a lot for a house that is trying to act out of self-preservation, as the Baratheons clearly are, because rightfully so, they would look at this situation and go, okay, the ruling family is splintered and it doesn't know up from down. It doesn't know who's in control. So what am I going to get out of this? Like, if I got to be in the middle of this chaos, like, I'm going to get mine. And so I think it says a lot about the position that the Blacks are in. And I also think it says a lot about the state of sort of the political landscape moving forward for the rest of the series. It's going to be about these families on the outside, what they're going to be able to get out of getting into an inter-family conflict. So I actually think that Lord Baratheon is completely within his rights to say, like, I'm not getting involved with your stuff unless I'm getting something out of it. At the end of the day, like, he's looking out for himself.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I actually think Lord Baratheon, a little harsh in some of his words, but I mean, to his point, hey, you guys both say you're the ruler. Well, what really signals that you're the ruler? That you can offer something as sort of a symbol of your partnership or lordship or whatnot, versus, hey, well, Rhaenyra says she's got the power, but she has literally nothing to give me to back it up. So now we're just relying off of like word. I don't know. I think it's a fair position that he takes. And yes, it is nice to think that, anytime someone says something that they will always stick to the word. But the reality is, both in Westeros and I'd argue in the real world, is that words only go so far. And especially when it's like your dad said this thing like 20 plus years ago, it's a lot harder for anyone to say, yes, I will hold to my father's promise for our house, versus, listen, I just inherited this bad decision. Right now I have an option to make a good decision and a bad decision, one that's going to benefit my house and one that's going to potentially set me back and make me a target of the people who claim to be in power. I'm going to go with the power that also comes with some perks. So yeah, Ben, I think you outlined it really, really well. Now, also, guys, I just want to take a moment to talk about how Aemond is and I know I've said this, so I'm sorry to repeat myself, but God, are they going out of their way to make him the most anime character in a Game of Thrones show? The way he is, even the way, like when Luke shows up, even the way that he's standing, he's got like he's like turned to his side, one leg sticking out with his hand up. And you're like, what the hell is he doing? I don't know. It looks cool. It looks like I could make some custom art out of it. It looks badass, but like people don't stand like that with an eye patch. But yes. So at the end of the day, Luke realizes this is not his call. He is just the messenger. Baratheon wisely is like, get your shit out of my house. If you guys are going to fight, do it elsewhere. And Luke tries to walk away, but, we know that Aemond, much like Daemon, ready for a fight. They want to do it. Like he wants to instigate a conflict, and he wants to taunt Rhaenyra the Blacks into starting the war, essentially, is kind of the vibe I was getting. I think I don't know, maybe he wasn't thinking of it in terms of war. I think he was, but he knows how to punch their buttons, and he knew to bring up the Lord Strong piece and bring up this, childhood squabble. Obviously he lost an eye, but it's a thing that's like kind of buried in the past, to bring it up as a means to justify the way he's egging it on. But notice he does not strike first when in the conflict between him and Luke. Now Luke flees on his dragon Arax, and Arax is a lot smaller, giving him makes him a little faster potentially. But Aemond and Vhagar are just fast enough to keep up. And I don't know about you guys, I thought this sequence really showcased, better than any other scene in the season so far, just how different the dragons are, and exactly, when they say Vhagar is the biggest dragon, you're like, okay, he's the biggest dragon. But what does that mean? We're talking about the difference between a puddle jumper and a 747, airplane size difference. And just to be able to see that scale during this chase was incredible. And it really had me on the edge of my seat. So Ben, I'm going to turn it back to you here. I mean, how well does this sequence showcase that dragon on dragon fighting that is certainly going to be in store for the future of the show?
Oh, extremely well. This scene is shot extremely well, directed extremely well. The CGI in this scene is as good as I have ever seen these dragons look. I think that, like you said, the difference of scale is tremendous, and it also this, as obvious as this may seem, it helps to sort of keep this scene from being just a blur of CGI, like two sort of non-distinct winged CGI creatures kind of scratching at each other, where you don't really know who's who. I think that if this is going to be the sort of like dragon-backed combat that we're going to expect from the rest of this series, we're in very good hands. Yeah, I was really impressed with it. And we talked about this a little bit earlier about just, pure spectacle, and how maybe there wasn't a ton of it in this season, for better or for worse. But this is like a full-blooded through and through action scene, something that, if you were to watch it on a big screen, it would be, breathtaking. So, I definitely am looking forward to more where this came from.
Yeah, well said. Daniel?
Yeah, I think that this cinematography was absolutely beautiful during this whole sequence. Again, we get the lightning sort of revealing that the Arax is right above them, and has been following them this whole time. I think, and the tension that's existing in the scene, the whole time I wasn't 100% sure what Aemond. Is Aemond out to kill him? What's he doing? So I think the tension here is fantastic. I think the scenes that we get throughout the storm, and then, how it converts to the sort of above the clouds in the final moments, I think that all just looks great. And to echo what Ben said, I think if this is the type of, it also, first, before I get to that, just the massive scale that you guys talked about, I didn't realize that the scale was that big. So this is a great way to show just how absolutely massive Arax is. And
real quick correction. It's Vhagar that's the really big, Arax is the small one. Vhagar.
So yeah, just the massive scale and how big Vhagar is. It just, I didn't realize it was that big. So, or that he was that big. So just the, how much of an advantage that's going to be moving forward. To showcase that, I think was done really well. And so this whole scene, I think, was really fantastic. But also, I think one of the main takeaways for me, potentially foreshadowing a lot of what might happen in later seasons, is that it seems like we get those hints of the writers not being able to fully control with their words the dragons, right? It seems like, and generally speaking, that this was this wasn't what Aemond was striving for. It seems like he was mostly just trying to sort of antagonize and mess with him. But it seems like, we have Luke basically saying when Arax spits fire at Vhagar, he sort of says something like, no, like, don't keep flying straight or whatever. And then Aemond also, after the attack, looks very startled and shocked once you see Luke die. So I think that's sort of some foreshadowing of like, hey, it goes back to what Daemon, I think, said at the very beginning of the season, like, this is the fact that we can control these dragons is an illusion that we use to rule the kingdoms. But if we're going to get into actual battle, it doesn't seem like the riders have full control, and that becomes very scary for all people on dragons moving forward. And I think that was like the big takeaway for me. Just also, the fact that Luke dies and Rhaenyra's response to that and how tragic that is. I think basically, like I think you said at the very beginning when we started recording, Caleb, this is the moment that brings us to war. And it's interestingly, it's sort of even though Aemond is being like a dick, it's an accident. It wasn't like an intentional act, but that's the thing that's going to be the final straw that brings us to war.
Well, I was going to ask about that. So Daniel doesn't think it's an accident. Ben, do you think, or Daniel thinks it's an accident? Ben, are you thinking this is an accident? Do you think Aemond did a whoopsie, or was this like something he wanted?
I think subconsciously it's what he wanted. And this is what I was talking about earlier with the idea that maybe the dragons were sort of reacting to the feelings of the people on them. That's something that we know both in the context of this series, but also in just like a real world context. That's something that happens with horses. Even if you are trying to command them to do something else, if they feel or sense like a certain emotion out of you, which they're very good at doing, they'll react differently. They will totally feed off of your emotions. I think what we may find with Aemond is that he does possess a lot of the same sort of predisposal to anger, to rage, to acting out that Aegon does. But that he tries to keep it in check because he thinks of himself as maybe being a little bit above that. I know based on the last episode, he believes himself to be the person who is more given to ruling than Aegon is. In this case, I think he probably set out just to kind of spook him. Like, I don't know that he necessarily wanted to kill him, but I think there's a part of him that longs to be the kind of person that could kill somebody to defend his family and to kind of hold on to power. I also think that ultimately this is going to benefit him. I think he wants to have a story like this. I think he wants to have that sort of specter over him. He wants that reputation to sort of precede him. Like, hey, look, like this guy killed his cousin. Like, he'll do, whatever it is that he needs to do. So I think it's more subconscious. I think that he is going to benefit from this in the long run in terms of his reputation and sort of his standing within the family. And I think that if that was sort of what he was feeling the rage. He was feeling like, man, if only I could just, pull the trigger on this. I think maybe that is what the dragon was feeding off of.
I love the analogy with the horse, Ben, because I'm with you 100% lockstep. I think if you were to ask him, I think he's going to, okay, firstly, I think he's going to own this situation, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, kinslaying, which is typically frowned upon in Westeros, I think in this very specific circumstance, he will be able to use to his benefit to establish a reputation of fear, which is what he wants. Okay, moving that from the equation now. I think if you ask him as he's getting on the dragon, what's he going to do? He's like, I'm just messing with the guy. Just want to show him who's boss. Want to assert my authority. What I think, though, is, I mean, he gets pretty... Some of the stuff he says is pretty nasty before they get on the dragons anyway. I think he wants to kill him. I think he is tired of pretending... I think he's tired of the societal norms holding him, keeping him from establishing his sort of ambitions, or sorry, fulfilling his ambitions, which is this dude wants to be an epic badass. It's really interesting that him and Daemon obviously have quite a bit in common. I think they have a lot of the same sensibilities. And this is where maybe they differ, where I think Daemon, especially in his older years, decides to slow down and settle down and study, goes to Pentos for like a decade or whatever. This is like Daemon before he did that. And if he had the biggest dragon in Westeros and they were on the cusp of war, this is the kind of thing he would do. So I think it's something he wanted to do internally. And because the dragon, firstly, the dragon got a little puff of the Arax fire on him, and B, because I think it was able to sense sort of the adrenaline and the emotions coming from Aemond, was like, yep, let's just chomp this thing in half. I can do it. It's easy. But I do think the last thing I'll say is I do kind of like the idea, though, that these wars like this that we're going to see unfold are, really just products of family squabbles that reach a climax. And in this case, it's two, they're not cousins, second, I don't know, it's confusing, related relatives who have a history as kids of pranking each other, and it just goes too far, right? That is essentially what is going to start a war in which tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are probably going to die. And there's something weirdly tragic and true to life about that, I think. Ben?
Yeah, I was just sitting here, as you said, not cousins. I was sitting here trying to piece that together in the family tree. I guess Luke would be his nephew?
Half nephew.
So yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that, I think that you're spot on there when you're talking about sort of the feeling that that when you're talking about an inter-family squabble, I think ultimately sorry, I completely lost my train of thought. We're going to pause for a second.
Yep.
So I think a lot of what has made this show compelling has been the way that it has reduced what in the previous series was like a number of houses fighting for influence against each other. It has boiled it down to fighting within one family. And so I think that kind of gives you the opportunity to view the struggle for power through different people in the same family. And I think in the case of Aemond, I think what you end up seeing with him, and I hope this ends up continuing because I think this character has a lot of potential. I think what you end up seeing with him is somebody who is drawn between, like you said, the side of Daemon that was completely sort of unfiltered and unhelped, where he was out for himself, where he was out for war, where he was out for blood and vengeance, and that he acted impulsively, and the part that maybe sees himself as actually being sort of like a unifying or I guess moderating force within the family. So I'll be curious to see how that ends up panning out when it comes to Aegon. I think Aegon has proven himself to be, let's say, less than trustworthy. I think that there's a real opportunity here for him to be every bit as bad, if not worse, than Joffrey. And I think that Aemond, even though he himself is not an angel, I think that there's a real opportunity here for him to maybe prove himself to be more worthy of that title.
We will see. I definitely think they have made him far more compelling than I expected him to be when he was introduced initially. Well, we find out to close us out. Final scene, Daemon delivers the word of Lucerys' fate to Rhaenyra. What does the look on her face tell you about her mindset in the closing moment of the season? Daniel Stahl.
Yeah, I think, we talked about how much restraint Rhaenyra has shown in this particular episode, and how much growth she's had since the beginning of her arc back in the first couple of episodes. And, my inclination is that shows us that the restraint is gone. So even though we were able to get her to that point and respect her and pull for her because of her restraint, it is also I completely can understand why that restraint might leave her now. And so I think that is just sort of like the foreshadowing for the upcoming seasons of the show. That we have arrived at we kept calling it like a powder keg ready to explode this whole season. Like, we have arrived at the moment where the explosion has gone off, and we are going to see the effects of that. So in the next few seasons. So that's for me what it says is no more restraint from Rhaenyra. It is, the war has started.
Yeah, this means war. Ben,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts?
So weirdly, I've been thinking a lot about this particular shot over the last 24 hours because in the moment when I was watching it, Daemon came in, they shoot it all from behind. It's quiet. You don't hear what he actually tells her. She breaks down and you kind of see her crying. And I kind of knew, and I don't even necessarily mean this as a criticism because I ended up really coming out the other side thinking that this was the right choice, that dramatically it's really satisfying. But I kind of knew, I was like, oh, okay, so she's going to break down and whatnot. And then she's going to perk up and turn around and look at the camera, smash to black, because that's actually something that we've seen multiple times in other properties. I was like, okay, they did that in The Matrix. They did that in The Hunger Games. Like, this is an ending that we have seen before. But I was kind of thinking about why it worked for me better, even though I sort of understood that it was a little on the derivative side. And I realized that it's like a total flip on what it is that I expect from scenes like that. I sort of expect the camera to linger on the character's face, and like we see the full sort of like spectrum of emotions, and then you kind of like you lean down and then you look back up, and like the anger is there. Like we kind of linger on that. That's again, how it was done in The Matrix Reloaded. It was how it was done in The Hunger Games. Like, this is something that I felt like I'd seen before, and I realized what was brilliant about it is that when we enter that room and she turns around and Daemon comes up and gives her that news, that is the last time we are going to see that version of Rhaenyra. We do not even see her die. Like we see just from behind, like she turns around and that is the last time that she is that version of this character. And when she turns around, she is the version of that character we are going to see for the rest of the series. And I thought, wow, like shooting that from the back, like even if I felt like maybe that specific shot as an ending was something like, yeah, it was real predictable. It was something I sort of knew was coming. I go like, wow, okay, like that is done in a way that is so sophisticated and sort of speaks to where the series is going and sort of the implications moving forward, that I ended up totally coming out the other side, and I was really excited about it. Yeah, what does that look mean? I mean, yeah, like shit's about to go down. Like she is ready to go. That was the final straw. She has been broken. The old Rhaenyra is dead, and she's coming for blood.
Yeah. Yeah, I think she's coming for blood, and I don't, I suspect that any sort of inclination she had to be more charitable or to lean on the family ties, or even going beyond that, the ties she has with Allison as childhood friends, it's out the window. It doesn't mean anything anymore. What matters is power. And yeah, I think, seeing, I love how you put that, Ben, that she is dead. The Rhaenyra we see turn around in that scene is not the Rhaenyra we saw earlier in the episode. That's for certain. And, to a certain extent, I mean, we'll have to debate it next season, but she's somewhat justified in taking this approach. We see kind of the justification that she has in thinking, and sort of the look of I'm out for blood. I mean, she's lost a lot while also trying to be charitable. You could argue the same for Allison as well, but at this point, Rhaenyra is the one who's lost a child, so it's going to be war. With that said, gentlemen, we have reached the conclusion of our recap of this week's episode, the season 1 finale of House of the Dragon. Now, as part of a new segment that we are doing this year, we're wrapping up each episode by awarding honors to various characters in an episode. Always who wins, who loses, and who is the biggest wildcard player. Also, if you do have a special award to name, feel free to introduce that as well. Daniel Stoll, what are your selections this week?
Yeah, for me, for this week's winner, I went with Aemond. I think that he was able to show the power that he holds with Vhagar, and so he's going to be a formidable foe moving forward. So he was this week's winner for me. For this week's loser, I went with Luke. That was very sad and tragic to have him go out the way, especially when he was just trying to do a good job. Like it wasn't like he wasn't getting involved in Aemond's sort of shenanigans. He was just trying to do what his mother asked for him, and it ends up losing his life. So he's definitely the loser for sure. This week's wild card, I feel like it was actually a little bit interesting because, usually when we've been saying who the wild card is, we've said we don't know where certain people's or certain characters' allegiances lie. I think we've started to really define which characters are on which side. But for that reason, the houses that we haven't heard from yet, like the Starks and the Tullys, I think those are where the wild cards are going to lie. Who are they going to side with? And then for the special award, I already said it once, but I've got to say it again. The special award this week has got to be the coolest Dungeons and Dragons map I've ever seen. I can't wait to have that at my table.
Very nice. I too can't wait to play Dungeons and Dragons at your table, Daniel. It's going to be great. We'll stream it online so everyone can see your epic table. It's cool.
Yeah, I'm down for that. But maybe we shouldn't make promises yet on the podcast.
Yeah, you said it. You said you like the table. Ben Friend, what are your selections for this week?
All right, so for the winner this week, I also went with Aemond. I do believe, like I said, the events of the end of this episode are going to benefit him greatly in terms of his sort of position. He drew his first real blood, right? I mean, he's going to be viewed as a warrior from here on out. And even if he was the one that ultimately incites the war, if his side believes that this is a war that's worth fighting, honestly, they're going to feel like, well, somebody had to, right? And I mean, he was brave enough to be the person to go out and do it. And that the version of this tale he'll spin will be one that is really beneficial to him. Like, he fought valiantly and he had to fight for his life, but he did what he had to do to protect himself and his family. This week's biggest loser, I would go with Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra had a horrible week. She lost 2 children in one episode. So even if she's going to continue from a position of strength moving forward, it would be hard to look at the week that she had and not think that she didn't get dealt kind of a shit hand. So I'm going to say Rhaenyra, this week's biggest loser. Our wild card, I think for the whole season even has been Rhaenys, and I think that she will continue to be a wild card. Her and Lord Corlys are going to only be out for themselves, and I think by the end of this episode, I'm still not entirely sure where their allegiance actually stands, despite the fact that they are ostensibly pledged to Rhaenyra's cause. I do think that they are going to be the couple to look out for as the biggest wild cards moving forward. Now, my special award this week is going to go to Daemon, who had to have had the most confusing week of any character on this show. He finally got exactly what he wanted, and he didn't get it in any of the ways that he actually wanted it. He thought that he was going to finally get a war. He thought that he was going to be a war hero. He thought that he had married somebody that he could control. He thought that his children were going to be seen as heroes. He got none of those things. So even though he got his war, there was a lot of collateral damage in the process. So I think my special award goes to him, because I'm sure whatever version of, I was going to say medieval, but obviously this isn't real history, but whatever Dark Ages style therapy exists, I think it's probably time for Daemon to go and figure himself out, because he's got to have a lot of conflicting emotions. And of course, we got to give a shout out to Lord Grover, right? I mean, he gets the special award for most anticipated puppet newcomer in season 2.
Listen, I have to say, that is a pretty enticing special award. Best newcomer for season 2. I cannot wait to meet Lord Grover. Again, my understanding, I'm going to have to go back and fact check this, but I'm pretty sure he's the Lord of Riverrun. They're going to have to meet him to get the allegiance. So Puppet Grover coming soon. Can't wait. Okay. So this week's winner, I am actually going to go just, play devil's advocate a little bit. I do agree. Aemond is a great choice. I'm going to go with Otto Hightower, because he too wanted maybe he didn't win a war. He wanted to establish dominance over Rhaenyra, probably via murder. And after this episode, he's going to have the grounds to do it. And in fact, you talk about Aemond telling his own story. He can make up whatever he wanted. He can say that Luke attacked him while he was vulnerable, whatever it is. And it gives the Greens and Otto, who is ostensibly the patriarch running this show, the ammunition he needs to justify the war that, again, I don't know if actual war was his end game, but it is certainly a part of the scheme that will give him the power that he desires. So just to mix it up a little bit, I'm going to go with Otto Hightower. This week's loser, I agree with Ben. Rhaenyra, huge loss. Don't need to repeat too much what was said there. And also just women in leadership in general. I mean, it's the same with Alicent last week, but I think that's the hardest part with Rhaenyra, was she was honestly trying to stop the war and was honestly trying to find a non-violent outcome to this. But unfortunately, because of the way the world of Westeros works, and because of the position, and because of just some bad luck, the escalation was inevitable. And that's sort of, there's a hint of tragedy there. So for those reasons, Rhaenyra is this week's loser. This week's wild card, I'm still going to say Daemon. I know we've said it, Daniel in particular, you've brought him up a few times, but here's the thing. I think now that Daemon has a reason to just be a loose cannon, it's only a matter of time before he does something crazy in season 2. Maybe he takes his dragon and levels a building. Something we didn't even have time to talk about. There was an entire scene where he was apparently bonding with another dragon, thought it was his dragon. Turns out not his dragon. That scene where we see him walk down in the crypts and sing to that very large dragon. The dragon's name was Vermithor, also known as the Bronze Fury, the third largest dragon in the realm. He was known for his great tan wings, and was third only to Velaryon and Vhagar. And he's also, according to a Wiki of Ice and Fire, almost 100 years old by the time of this episode. Didn't mention that, but I just, Daemon's up to no good next season, and he's going to do something irrational that is off the grid, or at least against Rhaenyra's wishes. Special award, I don't want to be too repetitive, but I like to call this one the character most likely to be impersonated for a spy award. Goes to Eric. Now that we know for a fact they're on opposing sides and they look identical, how long? Guys, I'm just throwing this. I hope this show doesn't go down the evil twin route. But Ben, as you you noted very early in this discussion, we've leaned on to leaned a little more on soap opera type tropes this season. I've enjoyed it. And if they execute it well, I guess an evil twin subplot could be a lot of fun in House of the Dragon. But, I hope we don't go there. That said, the special award for character most likely to be swapped out by a spy award goes to Eric.
If anyone gets amnesia on this show, they're going to have a full, Young and the Restless bingo. I'm just telling you.
Just Alicent. She's going to lose her memory and doesn't remember anything that happened after she was 15 years old. Yeah. Coming soon. All right, gentlemen. Well, we have gone very long tonight, so I want to wrap us up. But I just wanted to really quickly get your thoughts, just to close us out. What are you expecting to see? I said future seasons in the outline. Let's be more specific. What do you expect to see in season 2? And I asked this question. I should outline that George R. R. Martin himself says that he believes that there should be 4 total seasons to adapt this specific material. So with that in mind, Ben Friend, what do you expect to see in season 2?
Well, I don't want this to sound like a backhanded compliment, but I do hope for a little more stability in terms of time jumps, casting, that sort of thing. I know it's been said today. One of the showrunners came out and said, yes, we're done with the time jumps. This is where we live now. So what I'm hoping for is kind of a chance to breathe on that end, settle into a more sort of contemporary rhythm. Other than that, I don't have any specific expectations. I've not read Fire and Blood, so I don't really know where the story ends up leading. But it actually does kind of excite me that George R. R. Martin is saying hey, 4 seasons, that's going to be the amount of time to tell this story. It makes me think that if they have sort of a closed-ended, relatively shorter run to go off of, that the story is only going to get tighter from here on out. So that I am really looking forward to. I think if they can have a story Bible for the next 3 seasons, they can really dial in. My suspicion, and this is as someone I think that this was a really, really solid season of TV. I would give it a solid 3 to 3.5 out of 4 stars. I think that the next season and on, I think they've got a potential to tell a very, very high 4-star story moving forward.
Very nice. Bar is high. And hey, to your point, and we said this on the podcast previously for Game of Thrones, the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones are almost untouchable. Almost. They are, in terms of the writing and the pacing, the characterization, and then even, the way they were able to very cleverly use their VFX in those first 4 seasons before they were a giant monster runaway hit and had unlimited budgets, essentially. So no, and one of the reasons for that, I would suspect, my take is that they had very solid and clear source material to work on. And again, if you go back and read A Song of Ice and Fire, yes, there are going to be 7 books total, assuming George R. R. Martin can get them all written. But there is a clear beginning and middle and end to the War of the Five Kings arc, but from that takes place in the first book of Game of Thrones, the second book of Clash of Kings, and the third book of Storm of Swords, with so many climactic moments happening in Storm of Swords. So with that in mind, knowing that we already have the complete source material, at least for the Dance of Dragons, Ben, I think that is a very strong hypothesis and I think a very fair expectation to hold the show to. Daniel Stoll, what do you expect?
Just to also, echo what Ben was saying. I think that that's all something that I would expect as well. I also expect, this has done exceptionally, this show has done exceptionally well. We talked a lot at the beginning of the season how like every episode was gaining viewers, which is very rare for a TV show, starting at super high numbers and just going up instead of going down. I don't know what the last couple episodes ratings are or views or ratings are. We'll have to see. But the fact that it gained steam throughout the season is a very good sign. So I think that means we could expect to see, more dragons. Obviously we're in war. So moving forward. So I think we can see more dragon fights, and I expect the budget to shine moving forward. I think that it's reasonable to expect the budget to potentially go up after the success that this season has had. So that would be something I think that we could see. To talk about what could actually appear on screen, I think that's something that we can really look forward to.
Yeah, I think you're right, Daniel. The success of this first season definitely cements that, especially under the new Warner Brothers Discovery merger leadership, where they tend to double down on hits and kill everything else. It seems that, House of the Dragon probably going to have all the budget they need to make these epic dragon fights happen. So that's maybe not good for pop culture at large, but very good for House of the Dragon. Now that said, I think the one thing I'd add is I hope that while the storyline is more focused, I'm so glad we're done with the time jumps theoretically. I do really want us to keep an emphasis on the character and the palace intrigue. There's a good balance, right? Yes, the spectacle is great, but I also think, again, going back to the beginning of the podcast and what made Game of Thrones so great, especially those first 4 seasons, is people talking in rooms, the shadow players, people scheming, backstabbing, double dealing, like all that stuff. Those are the things, and especially when you add this layer of family that's mixed into it, there's so much potential for some A+ drama that the spectacle that is definitely coming will only underscore and make more powerful if it's done effectively. So yeah, I want to see more of that. I want to see a little bit more of our white worm. I want to see more of the not Loris. Oh shit, what's his name? Strong. Shit. Totally drawing a blank on his name.
Larys?
Larys, thank you. I want to see more of Larys Strong doing whatever it is the hell he's doing. Like, those are the sorts of things I want to see. I want to see spies on both sides. Like, those are the kinds of storylines I hope we get more of heading into the new season, especially now that we're more focused on this specific timeline. With all that said, ladies and gentlemen, that'll conclude our conversation covering Season 1, Episode 10, The Black Queen. I want to remind you, if you've enjoyed this conversation or any of the conversations we've had on the podcast yet so far this year, please make sure to let us know by heading on over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leaving us a rating and a review. And if you want to keep up with future of our conversations, including our Season 1 recap episode that'll be coming before we go on a hiatus, you can follow us on Twitter at cast_beyond_GOT, or you can hit us up on Facebook at facebook.com/castbeyondthewall. Ben, friend, we need to talk more often. Number 1.
Yes, we do.
Number 2, though, thank you for carving out some time on your Monday evening to talk House of the Dragon. Feels just like old times and reconnect for a couple of hours. Where can if folks want to follow your takes on the internet, where's the best place?
You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Letterboxd, the Dunkin' Donuts app, all of that at B3N Friend. It's just Ben Friend with a 3 instead of an E. Yeah, hit me up anytime.
Awesome. Daniel Stahl, what is your parting words for the people this week?
Thanks for tuning in. It's been awesome. I'm glad that we are back. I know that we had some reservations at the beginning of the season, wondering if this show would be any good at all, given the way that we felt about the ending of the last show. But I think that this show has been, and we'll get more into it in our next episode. But I think this has been a really fantastic fantastic season, and I hope that you guys stick with us. I'm excited to bring it back, and I know we have a long wait, but I think it's going to be worth it.
Indeed. Long wait, but it'll be a good time to be back with you gentlemen talking House of the Dragon in probably 2024. That said, if you want to keep up with me between now and 2024, you can also find me at this moment on Twitter at CMastersTalk. That's letter C Masters Talk. I'm also have my film review and analysis podcast, The Cinematic Schematic, which you can find over at thecinematropolis.com. We usually have 2 episodes drop a month there. Most recently, we did an episode covering Halloween Ends, which, I won't tell you how I feel about the movie other than that I felt like the conversation was significantly more compelling than the actual movie. And we also did just a look back at some of the best horror films from this year before September, including an in-depth spoilery discussion covering Barbarian, which, by the way, by the time you're listening to this, is now available on HBO Max, and you should go watch it. One, don't read anything about it. B, just boot up HBO Max and watch it. Get together with some friends. I promise you won't regret it. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning into our recap of House of the Dragon Season 1, Episode 10. I will be back in a couple weeks with at least one more episode before going on hiatus. Until then, remember, podcasts don't make us kings. Dragons with microphones do.